National level policy, once it's been set and agreed, can travel up, but can also travel down to sub-state level, to the regional level, down to the local level. And it does so in a lot of different ways, but with huge variation. Variation not just across states or countries, but variation according to the issue. And what usually happens is that at the national policy level, some sort of legislation or policy will be agreed, and then usually it's the responsibility of the sub-state level to implement that policy. It's not the national level; it's usually the sub-state level. And to what extent the sub-state level actors do that can vary a lot, often for political reasons. Do they agree with the politics surrounding the decision? Do they agree with the party who's in power? And this interaction, this relationship between the national level and the subnational level can be really important in deciding whether an issue of sustainability is adequately addressed. And it can work both ways. Sometimes what happens is if the national level, the state level, is inactive in this area, and one can often point to, say, the Bush administration in the US, you can have a lot of activity down below at the state level, almost compensating for the lack of action at the national level. But the inverse is also true, in that you might have quite a bit of activity, sustainability legislation of all different sorts at the national level, and then down below you might get obstruction to that and a refusal or at least a lag or neglect. So it can filter down, but it depends on a whole host of issues, and it depends on the political relationship between those two levels.
Okay, so if we think of something like the Climate Change Act, which I just mentioned, let's take the Scottish Climate Change Act. This, of course, places obligations on entities within its jurisdiction, within Scotland. Some of those regulated entities include local authorities, such as Edinburgh City Council. Now, you might think, well, what does climate change have to do with something like Edinburgh City Council? But of course, these local authorities are really quite powerful, potentially quite powerful actors in tackling climate change in a wide range of ways. In the most obvious way, local authorities, by virtue of their services, the services that they provide, are large users of energy. So if you think about schools or hospitals or street lights or waste services that councils undertake, these of course all have significant energy impacts. And so if local authorities became more energy efficient, that could make a significant contribution to reducing their carbon footprint. Another way in which local authorities can be significant is in their rules. So local authorities establish rules for things such as building standards and building codes. So if building codes were made far more rigorous in terms of heating and lighting, proximity to public transport, and so on and so forth, again, one could imagine that significant emission reduction consequences could follow. And actually, this is very much what local authorities, Edinburgh included, are doing. They're under an obligation to take such actions following under the Scottish Climate Change Act. And if you go to their website, you'll see that they have established a range of policies and programs specifically directed towards climate change.
The local level is a wonderfully promising level for action on sustainability, and that's for a couple reasons. One is that we know that individuals, citizens, are much more likely to respond to environmental issues, sustainability issues, if they can see a local impact. Okay? And they're more likely to make positive changes if they think those changes will have an impact. And so that means that movements such as the local food movement, reducing air miles, in Scotland there's something called the Fife diet that relies heavily on locally grown produce, that these serve a couple purposes. They show local citizens that they can take immediate small step action and yet still make a difference. And they also provide examples for other communities and other local levels. And one of the things that we have found, not just in Scotland and Edinburgh, but worldwide, is that the local level initiatives are very effectively shared with others. What works in one community, word gets round and it can be tried in other communities in terms of community gardens, in terms of implementing solar panels on homes and the like. Okay, the challenges are twofold, and one is that the lessons from successes elsewhere don't always transfer well or are not communicated well. And an example from Edinburgh is that many years ago there was an attempt to introduce congestion charges, similar to what they had in London. But unfortunately, this was introduced in a way that didn't reflect broad consultation from the Edinburgh locals, and it was unsuccessful here in Edinburgh. Not because the idea didn't work, but because the locals weren't, in my view, adequately involved in the process. The other challenge of local initiatives, including really amazing, successful ones, is okay, that's great, but how do we scale up? That's what we as researchers and practitioners need to work on. How do we take the local successes, which are everywhere and are inspiring, how do we scale those up so that they don't just remain local, but they move to other levels of governance as well?